The jungle didn't just surround you, it consumed you. It was a wet, green hell that swallowed sound, light, and hope. For Sergeant Vince Crowe, a hardened veteran of the island-hopping campaign, now stuck in the sticky morass of Vietnam, the problem wasn't just the elusive Viet Cong. The problem was in his hands. It was his M14 rifle. The M14 was a beautiful piece of machinery, a testament to American industrial might. It was also, in the close-quarters chaos of the jungle, a liability. It was long, heavy, and chambered for the powerful 7.62 51mm NATO round. Firing it on full auto was a joke. The recoil sent the barrel skyward after the first 2 rounds, wasting ammunition and revealing your position to every enemy within a mile. In a dense firefight, where engagements happened at 30 meters, not 300, a soldier needed speed and control, not brute power. Vince saw it happen again and again. A young private, his eyes wide with terror, would empty his magazine into the green wall on full auto, hitting nothing but foliage. A fire team would be pinned down, unable to effectively return fire because the heavy, lumbering rifles were difficult to maneuver in the thick undergrowth. The enemy, with their lighter, fully automatic AK-47s, could lay down a devastating volume of fire, keeping American heads down while they maneuvered. The final straw for Vince was a kid from Kansas named PFC Miller. They'd been ambushed on a trail. Miller, a good soldier, had tried to lay down suppressing fire. His M14 had danced in his hands, the 3rd round hitting a tree trunk 20 feet overhead. A single, well-aimed burst from an AK-47 silenced him forever. As Vince dragged Miller's body back, the weight of the dead soldier and the weight of the useless rifle felt the same. It was the weight of a doctrine that didn't fit the war. That night, in the pouring rain, sitting in a muddy foxhole, Vince made a decision. He was a career soldier, a man who believed in the chain of command, but he also believed in survival. The command wasn't listening. Reports about the M14's inadequacies were filed and forgotten. A new, smaller rifle called the AR-15 was being tested somewhere far away, but it was a rumor, a fantasy for the future. His men were dying today. He took apart his M14, the familiar ritual of cleaning it under the dim light of a red lens flashlight. He looked at the massive flash hider on the end of the barrel. It was designed for a different kind of war. He thought about the recoil, the muzzle climb. He wasn't an engineer. He was a mechanic's son from Detroit who understood how things worked. He understood leverage, force, and pressure. A crazy idea began to form, a heresy against every armorer's manual. What if he could tame the beast? What if he could redirect that violent, upward energy? He'd seen the principle before on artillery pieces. A muzzle brake. It used escaping gases to counteract recoil. The M14's gas system was sealed, but the gases exiting the barrel, they were wasted energy that got men killed. He found a discarded aluminum mess kit. It was tough, lightweight. With his combat knife and a file pilfered from the motor pool, he began to shape it under the relentless drip of the jungle rain. He wasn't designing. He was sculpting by feel, by instinct. He carved out a crude, multi-ported cylinder that could be fitted over the existing flash hider. It was ugly, a bastardization of a fine weapon. His platoon mates joked that he'd lost his mind. But Vince Crowe wasn't trying to win a design award. He was trying to win a firefight. He was trying to give his men a fighting chance in a green hell that demanded a new kind of devilry. He worked with the focus of a man possessed. The base motor pool became his unofficial workshop. He'd trade cigarettes for time with a drill press under the watchful, complicit eye of a sergeant who'd also seen too many boys come back in bags. The crude shard of mess kit metal slowly transformed into a rough cylinder with carefully angled ports drilled into the sides and top. His theory was simple. Redirect the escaping gases sideways and upwards to counteract the muzzle climb and recoil. but the muzzle device was only half the battle. Vince knew that control wasn't just about managing the rifle's jump, it was about the shooter's connection to it. The M14's trigger was heavy and gritty, a design for conscripts who might panic. A smoother, cleaner trigger would allow for faster, more accurate follow-up shots. Using a tiny whetstone and infinite patience, he began to polish the sear and trigger surfaces, a fraction of a millimeter at a time. This was even more forbidden territory, a direct modification to the firing mechanism. If an armorer inspected it, he'd be finished. Days turned into weeks. The modified rifle, now reassembled with its bastardized brake and secretively polished trigger, was a ticking time bomb in his hands. He couldn't test it on the official range. The risk of discovery was too high. His only chance would come during the next patrol, in the lethal laboratory of the jungle itself. He stored the rifle carefully, his heart pounding every time he looked at it. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. He had bet his career, and potentially his life, on a piece of scrap metal and a prayer. The patrol moved like ghosts through the emerald twilight of the jungle, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Sergeant Crow felt the weight of his modified M14 like a lead weight on his soul. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call sounded like the click of handcuffs. Today, his heresy would be tested not by armorers, but by the enemy. The contact was sudden and brutal. A staccato burst of AK-47 fire ripped through the silence from their left flank. A young soldier, Private Davis, cried out and went down, clutching his leg. The rest of the squad hit the dirt, returning fire with the familiar heavy boom 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 of their M14s. Muzzle flashes lit up the green gloom like malevolent fireflies. Vince saw what he needed to see. 2 Viet Cong fighters, using the dense cover, were maneuvering to flank them, their AKs chattering on full auto, keeping the Americans pinned. This was the exact scenario that had cost Miller his life. "Covering fire!" Vince roared, his voice cutting through the din. He didn't aim to kill. He aimed to control. He shouldered his rifle, took a breath, and squeezed the polished trigger. The result was nothing short of revolutionary. The familiar punishing kick of the M14 was gone. Instead of the barrel jerking upwards, it stayed remarkably level. The new, smooth trigger broke cleanly, allowing him to place a rapid, controlled second shot, and then a third. Crack, crack, crack. The 3 rounds stitched a tight pattern into the tree trunk where the first VC had been taking cover. The enemy fighter, shocked by the unexpected accuracy and speed of the fire, flinched back, his own spray of bullets going wildly off target. Vince shifted aim. The second VC was now exposed. Another controlled 3-round burst. The man crumpled. The flanking maneuver was broken. The firefight ended as quickly as it began. The jungle fell silent, save for the moaning of the wounded private and the ragged breathing of the squad. No one cheered. They stared at Vince, then at his rifle. They had all felt the difference, seen it with their own eyes. The weapon that had just saved them wasn't the standard M14. It was something else. Something better. Something forbidden. Later, as they patched up Davis and prepared to move out, Corporal Jenkins, the squad's cynic, walked up to Vince. He didn't say a word. He just looked at the homemade break on the end of Vince's barrel, then back at Vince's face, and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was all the confirmation Vince needed. He hadn't just won a firefight. He had won his first convert. The secret was out, and the stakes were higher than ever. News of the ambush and Sergeant Crow's miracle shots spread through the company not as a formal report, but as a whispered legend. By the time Captain Evans heard the story, third hand, exaggerated with tales of a single shot killing 3 VC, he knew he had a problem. He liked Crow. He was a solid NCO, reliable and tough. But this was insubordination of the highest order. He summoned Crow to his makeshift office, a sandbagged hut with a folding table. The modified M14 lay between them like an exhibit in a trial. "Sergeant," Evans began, his voice dangerously calm. "Explain this." Vince stood ramrod straight, his eyes fixed on the wall behind the captain. "Sir, the M14 is unsuitable for close-quarters jungle combat. The modifications improve controllability and allow for accurate rapid fire." "Modifications?" Evans picked up the rifle, his fingers tracing the rough ports of the aluminum brake. "You mean this souvenir? And don't think I haven't heard about the trigger. My God, Sergeant. Do you have any idea what the armorers would do if they saw this?" "I do, sir," Vince replied, his gaze never wavering. "But with all due respect, the Viet Cong aren't concerned with our armorers' manuals. Private Davis is alive because of this rifle. The rest of my squad is alive." Evans sighed, the anger draining from him, replaced by the heavy weight of command. He'd read the reports. He knew the M14 was a problem. But his job was to enforce regulations, not to sanction backyard engineering. "Your initiative is noted, Sergeant, and your results are impressive," the captain admitted, choosing his words carefully. "But I cannot and will not authorize this. You will draw a standard weapon from the armory immediately, and this," he gestured to the rifle, "this abomination will be dismantled." The order hung in the humid air. It was a direct command. To disobey was unthinkable. But then Evans did something unexpected. He didn't call for the armorer. He didn't fill out disciplinary papers. He simply looked at Vince, his expression unreadable. "That will be all, Sergeant," he said, his voice low. "You are dismissed." Vince saluted, turned, and left. The modified M14 remained on the captain's table. Evans stared at it for a long time. He knew the right thing to do as an officer, but he also knew the right thing to do for his men. He made a decision. He wouldn't report Crow, but he couldn't allow the rifle to exist. He would disassemble it himself and forget the whole thing. But as his hand touched the cold metal, he hesitated. He thought of Davis. He thought of the other sons he was responsible for sending home. He opened a drawer and, instead of dismantling the parts, he slid the entire rifle inside, locking it away. It was a problem for another day. The heresy had been discovered, but it had not been destroyed. It was merely dormant, waiting. The locked drawer in Captain Evans's office became a secret shrine to a forbidden idea. Vince, now armed with a standard M14, felt its absence like a phantom limb. The squad knew, too. The fire had been lit. In whispered conversations over sea rations and during night watch, the story of the tamed M14 grew. Jenkins, the former cynic, became its most vocal evangelist. "I saw it, clear as day. 3 shots, tight as a fist. The gook didn't know what hit him." But without the physical proof, it remained a rumor, a ghost story. Until the day the convoy was ambushed. It was a classic L-shaped ambush on a muddy red road. This time it wasn't a small fire team, but the entire platoon caught in the kill zone. The noise was deafening. Rocket-propelled grenades, the relentless chatter of AK-47s, and the panicked, ineffective full-auto response of the American M14s. Men were falling. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and blood. Captain Evans, pinned behind a truck, saw his command disintegrating around him. Standard doctrine was failing. His men were being slaughtered. In that moment of utter desperation, the ghost in the drawer materialized in his mind. It was no longer a violation of regulations. It was the only tool he had left. "Sergeant Crow!" he bellowed over the radio, his voice cracking. "My position, now!" Vince, moving low and fast through the hail of bullets, reached him. Evans didn't explain. He simply shoved the key into Vince's hand and pointed back toward the base. "The rifle! Now, God damn it!" It was the longest sprint of Vince's life. Back at the company area, he burst into the empty office, fumbled with the lock, and grabbed the modified M14. It felt like coming home. He returned to the hell of the ambush. He didn't fire wildly. He became a surgeon. He identified a machine gun nest pinning down the platoon's left flank. He found a stable position, ignored the rounds snapping past his head, and breathed. Crack, crack, crack. The tight grouping of rounds silenced the nest. He shifted. An RPG team was setting up. Crack, crack. One fell, the other scrambled for cover. He wasn't just shooting, he was orchestrating. The controlled, accurate fire broke the enemy's rhythm. It gave the platoon the precious seconds they needed to reorganize, to return effective fire, to call in artillery. The tide of the battle turned. When the last shots echoed away and the medevac choppers thundered in, a strange silence fell. This time, everyone had seen it. Not a rumor, but a fact. Captain Evans looked at the grimy, blood-spattered sergeant holding the ugliest, most effective rifle in Vietnam. The regulation book in his mind had been burned away by the reality of survival. He walked over to Vince, put a hand on his shoulder, and spoke words that would change everything. "Sergeant, don't you dare clean that rifle. We're sending it up the chain. We're sending it all the way." The ghost had been unleashed, and it was heading for the Pentagon. The journey of Sergeant Crow's modified M14 from the mud of Vietnam to the polished linoleum of the Pentagon was a saga in itself. Captain Evans, staking his own career, bypassed the usual channels. He sent the rifle with a trusted courier and a personal, passionately written report directly to a colonel in Ordnance Corps he'd served under in Korea, a man known for practical solutions over blind doctrine. In a sterile testing facility in the United States, the rifle was met with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. Lab technicians scoffed at the crude aluminum break, calling it a field expedient abomination. But when they placed it in a firing rest and ran tests, the data was undeniable. Recoil was reduced by 38%. Muzzle climb was negligible. The polished trigger provided a consistent, clean break. The real battle began in a conference room. Men in crisp uniforms, who hadn't heard a shot fired in anger in years, examined the rifle like it was a foreign artifact. "It's a violation of a dozen procurement regulations," one major stated flatly. "We can't have every sergeant in the Army redesigning his weapon." "But the data doesn't lie," argued a younger, combat-seasoned captain, brought in as an advisor. "This solves the controllability issue. It's what our boys need now." "The solution is the new AR-15 program. It's in testing. It's the future," countered a civilian contractor whose company had millions invested in the M14's production line. "And how many more will die waiting for that future?" the young captain shot back. The debate raged. The rifle was a threat. To budgets, to egos, to entire career paths built on the existing system. It was an ugly, undeniable truth that made their beautiful, expensive doctrines look foolish. Meanwhile, a parallel, quieter evaluation was happening. A small team of engineers, divorced from the bureaucratic fray, took the core principles of Crow's modifications: the muzzle brake for recoil control, the improved trigger for shooter accuracy, and began to refine them. The mess kit aluminum was replaced with forged steel. The crude ports were precision machined for optimal gas flow. The trigger polish was standardized into a new, smoother assembly. They weren't just evaluating a modified rifle. They were reverse engineering a concept born of desperation. They created a formal kit that could be applied to existing M14s, a stopgap solution that was both effective and, crucially, could be officially sanctioned. A compromise was reached. The Army would not adopt Sergeant Crow's illegal rifle, but it would quietly begin a program to field the new recoil reduction kit to select units in high-intensity combat zones. The AR-15 program was accelerated. Sergeant Vince Crowe never received a medal for his innovation. He finished his tour and went home. But he had achieved something far greater. He had forced a massive, slow-moving bureaucracy to look up from its manuals and listen to the man in the mud. He had proven that the most powerful weapon in any army isn't just its technology, but its willingness to adapt, even when the adaptation comes from the most unexpected and unauthorized places. Vince Crowe returned to a world that had moved on. There was no parade for him, no ceremony. He slipped back into civilian life in Detroit, the phantom weight of his M14 replaced by the very real heft of a wrench in an auto factory. The jungle, the firefights, the constant hum of fear. It all became a collection of silent, private memories. He never spoke of the modified rifle. It was a closed chapter, a secret between him, his squad, and the war. Years bled into decades. The M14 was eventually phased out, replaced by the very weapon his heresy had helped accelerate. The M16. One afternoon, his grandson, a bright-eyed teenager obsessed with military history, was watching a documentary on the evolution of infantry weapons. "Grandpa, come look," the boy called out. "They're talking about the M14. Vince sighed, setting aside his newspaper, and settled into his armchair. The screen showed crisp color footage of a rifle range. A narrator explained the M14's shortcomings in Vietnam. And then, the scene shifted to a close-up of a modern, sleek rifle, an M4 carbine, the descendant of the M16. The lessons learned in the jungles of Southeast Asia were brutal but essential, the narrator intoned. They led to a fundamental shift in rifle design, emphasizing controllability in automatic fire. Key to this was the widespread adoption of advanced muzzle brakes and refined trigger systems, technologies that saw their first practical, large-scale combat testing in that conflict. The camera zoomed in on the M4's sophisticated muzzle device, a compact, precision-machined piece of steel with ports and baffles. It was a world away from a carved-up mess kit, but the principle was identical. Redirect the force. Control the weapon. Vince's grandson pointed at the screen. "See, Grandpa? They fixed it. They put a brake on it, just like you said they should have." Vince didn't respond. He just stared at the screen, a slow, deep warmth spreading through his chest, a feeling more profound than any medal could ever provide. He had never seen the official reports. He had no idea his rifle had sparked a bureaucratic war that led to a new kit, that his desperate act of survival had become a data point in a revolution. He had simply seen a problem and, in defiance of every rule, tried to solve it. He was a mechanic, not a visionary. But in that moment, watching the legacy of his illegal idea being explained by a narrator to his own grandson, he understood. The true impact of a soldier isn't always in the enemies he kills, but in the futures he helps save. The chain of innovation he had forged in a muddy foxhole was now unbreakable standard doctrine. He looked at his grandson and finally smiled, a quiet, private smile. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough with age and emotion. "Yeah, they fixed it." The story was over. The circle was closed. The sergeant's idea, once a court-martial offense, was now taught to every new soldier. And that was the only victory that ever really mattered.